No way. You're her. The words were a choked whisper coming from a man trained to show no fear. He recognized the call sign, the one they speak about in hushed tones during mission debriefs, the name my own father was convinced was just some battlefield myth. And in that single frozen moment, the man my father had just called a real warrior was staring at me at his own daughter, as if I were a god of war. I gave him a single, almost perceptible nod. It was all the confirmation he needed. To understand the look on that seal's face, and the profound, deafening silence that consumed my father. You have to go back 2 hours back to a VFW hall that smelled of stale beer and misplaced pride. The room was a sea of faded uniforms and booming laughter. And I tried to make myself small in a corner, just another anonymous face. But my father, Robert, a retired Army colonel who wore his past glory like a second skin, could never be anonymous. He held court near the bar, his voice a familiar, overbearing drumbeat, and at his side, practically welded to his shoulder, was the reason we were all there. Lieutenant Miller, a young decorated Navy SEAL, with the kind of battlefield charisma that made old men feel young and important again. He was the son my father always wanted. An old acquaintance of my father's nodded in my direction. Is that your girl? Robert. What's she up to these days? My father scoffed. A sound I knew better than my own name. It was the sound of dismissal. Here. He waved as if shooting a fly. Oh, she pushes pixels for the Air Force. Some database analyst in a bunker in Maryland. We're proud. Of course. But he leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble as he gripped Miller's shoulder. Men like this fine lieutenant are the real warriors. He looked right at me then, a smirk playing on his lips. The Taliban wouldn't fear a daughter like you. The words landed like a physical blow, a public declaration of my worthlessness. The old veteran's laughter was hollow. I just stood there, my face a mask of calm, but inside a cold, familiar fury began to burn. All those years of being overlooked, of my achievements being minimized. The scholarship, he called a nice little hobby, the combination he dismissed as a participation trophy. It all coalesced into that one brutal sentence. Lieutenant Miller didn't laugh. He just looked at me. His expression unreadable and deeply uncomfortable. He knew something they didn't. My father's laughter echoed in the hall. He thought he was just telling an old joke, diminishing his disappointing daughter to elevate his surrogate son. He had no idea. He just publicly insulted the commander of Operation Nightfall, right in front of one of its few survivors. To understand the silent reckoning that was about to unfold, you have to understand the two lives I was living. To my father, the world was simple. It was divided into predators and prey, warriors and clerks, heroes, and, well, everyone else. Family dinners were his favorite battlefield for this particular lesson. A place where he could relive his glory days as an infantryman over mashed potatoes and gravy. He'd talk about the grit, the mud, the visceral reality of looking your enemy in the eye. He spoke of courage as a purely physical thing, something you could measure in miles, marched and walls breached. His stories were always loud, always centered on himself, and always aimed at an audience of one. Me. So, Annie, he'd ask, turning to me after a particularly long monologue about a long-forgotten skirmish, what great battles did you fight from your desk today? The question was never genuine. It was a performance for the rest of the table. I learned early on to give the answer he wanted, the one that kept me invisible, just cross-referencing some threat assessments. Dad, he'd pat my hand, a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than affection. That's nice. Sweetie? Keep those spreadsheets tidy. In his world, I was just the clerk, a necessary but ultimately unimportant cog in a machine whose glorious purpose I could never truly understand. It was a nickname he used often, especially when he was comparing me to Lieutenant Miller. Miller's picture, a glossy print from a military magazine, was framed and given, the place of honor on our mantle, right next to my father's own service medals. My university degree was tucked away in a box in the attic. My father would show Miller's texts like they were dispatched from the front line. The tip of the spear, he'd call him, his voice thick with pride. And I was by implication just the shaft, the support staff, the footnote in the story of real men doing real work. Each word was another quiet confirmation of a truth I'd lived with my whole life. In my father's eyes, I simply wasn't enough. But my father's house wasn't my real world. My real world was a place he couldn't even imagine. A place of absolute silence. Deep underground. Lit only by the cold blue glow of 100 screens. It was a tactical analysis center where the only sounds were the quiet hum of servers and the soft tapping of keyboards. There were no heroic speeches here. No stories of past glory. There was only the present unfolding in real time in pixels and encrypted data streams that represented thousands of lives. This was where I wasn't the clerk. This was where I was in command. My direct superior was General Carlson, a 3-star general with eyes that had seen too much, and a man of few words, where each one carried the weight of a command. He didn't care about my father's legacy or where I came from. He only cared what I could do. He stood behind me that night, his posture rigid. As we monitored a high-stakes operation in a remote mountain range, we were watching ghosts, tracking a high V-value target through a network of informants and satellite feeds. Everything was going according to plan until it wasn't. Suddenly, our primary intelligence feed dissolved into a blizzard of static. The line went dead. The silence in the room changed. It went from focused to heavy, suffocating. The ground team was blind, moving through hostile territory, with no eyes in the sky. We had seconds to make a decision. A wrong call could mean an international incident. Or worse, a dozen dead soldiers. I could feel the general's presence behind me. His trust, a heavy weight on my shoulders. My own pulse was a steady, slow drum in my ears. While my father saw spreadsheets, I saw lives. I saw the branching paths of probability, the faint signals in the noise, and I made the call. Abort the strike vector, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. It was calm, measured, betraying none of the chaos in my mind. Retask Sentinel Drone Togril 4 Delta. I have a new heat signature. Authenticate Asset Pathfinder, and confirm P before we engage. Execute silent vigilance protocols. For 30 agonizing seconds. The only sound was the hum of the machines. Then a new feed flickered to life. My heat signature was the target. The ground team was 2 clicks in the wrong direction, heading straight for an ambush. We had averted a catastrophe. The collective quiet exhale in the room was the only applause I needed. General Carlson simply placed a hand on my shoulder for a moment. Good call, Angel, he said, in his voice a low rumble of approval. That was my other name. Not the clerk, but Angel, a call sign given to me by the operators on the ground, whose lives depended on the ghosts I saw on my screens. A name I could never mention at the dinner table. A name my own father would have laughed at. My father only respected the glory he could see. Medals. Muscles. Front-page heroes. He couldn't comprehend a war fought in whispers and shadows by people he'd dismiss as clerks. For years I let him live in his world. But after that day at the VFW hall, I decided it was time to issue him a formal invitation into mine. Driving back to my apartment that night, the explosive anger I expected to feel never came. Instead, a kind of cold, quiet clarity settled over me. My father's words still echoed, but it was the look on Lieutenant Miller's face that I couldn't shake. That flash of recognition and deep discomfort. My father's careless boast wasn't just a personal insult anymore. It was a potential breach of operational security, and Miller knew it. For years, I had tried to earn my father's respect by speaking his language of emotion and family. It never worked. A loud, tearful argument would be useless. Just another instance of his daughter being too sensitive. But protocol, ceremony, rank, that was a language he revered. It was the foundation of his entire world. And I decided in the sterile quiet of my car that I would finally speak to him in terms he couldn't ignore. The annual Joint Special Operations Command Award ceremony was 3 weeks away. It was a classified event held in a secure facility where honors were given for actions the public would never know about, to people whose names were often redacted, even from the official citations. I was scheduled to receive a commendation for my leadership during Operation Nightfall. The next day, I sat down at my secure terminal, the one my father imagined. I used for spreadsheets and opened the guest submission portal. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a steady, deliberate rhythm as I typed in the 2 names. Colonel Robert Jensen, retired. Lieutenant David Miller. The system sought justification for their release. I wrote presence required for educational and debriefing purposes related to the citation subject matter. It was technically true, This would be an education. To finalize it, I made a call on a secure line to General Carlson's aide, keeping my voice level and professional. I didn't explain the personal connection. I didn't need to. I need confirmation that the 2 non-essential personnel I added to the combination ceremony list have been cleared and will be escorted to the main auditorium. I stated it is vital for the after-action review that they witness the unredacted citation. The aide didn't hesitate. Yes, ma'am. The general has already signed off. They'll be on the manifest. The trap was set, sealed with the very bureaucracy my father worripped. The invitations were sent out on official JC letterhead, sealed with the kind of authority my father revered. He called me, his voice bursting with a pride I had never heard directed at me. I knew that boy was destined for greatness. He boomed, assuming his protégé was being honored. They had no idea they weren't attending his ceremony. They were attending mine. The auditorium was less a room and more a declaration of power. It was sterile, silent, and cold, with perfect rows of seats filled by a sea of decorated officers whose collective service records could fill a library. There was no press, no family members snapping photos, no outsiders. This was an inner sanctum, a place where the real history of modern warfare was written in hushed tones. My father, Robert, and Lieutenant Miller were escorted to their VIP seats in the very front row. My father practically vibrated with pride, his chest puffed out, nodding at colonels and generals as if he were one of them. He believed he was finally in the room where it happened. Beside him, Miller was a statue of coiled tension. His eyes, unlike my father's, darted around the room, taking in the sheer weight of authority present. He knew professionally that this was no standard combination ceremony. He looked like a soldier in a minefield, sensing something was profoundly wrong, but unable to see the threat. Then my father saw me. I was standing off to the side near the stage in my simple Air Force dress uniform, my hands clasped behind my back. He gave me a small condescending smile and a little wave, the kind you give the parking attendant. In his mind, I was here to hand out programs or fetch water. It was the last time he would ever look at me that way. General Carlson walked to the podium, and a deep, respectful silence fell over the room. He was the embodiment of everything my father worripped. A warrior, a leader, a man whose presence commanded absolute difference. He began to speak, his voice calm and steady, and I watched my father lean forward, ready to soak in the praise he was sure was coming for his protégé. The general wasn't talking about Miller. He was talking about a mission. I'm here today to speak about Operation Nightfall. He began an operation that neutralized the entire leadership of a hostile network, preventing what intelligence assessed would have been a catastrophic attack on Allied forces. I saw a flicker of movement beside my father. It was Miller. His posture had become rigid. The operation's name was classified, known only to those who were there. The general continued, his words sanitized, but heavy with unspoken meaning. This victory came not from a barrage of firepower, but from the surgical precision of one commander, operating thousands of miles away. He spoke of a moment during the operation when a ground team was sent on a ghost trail, a deliberate misdirection by the enemy. He talked about how their communications were cut off, and how they were walking into a perfectly laid trap. I watched Miller's face. The color was draining from it, his knuckles turning white, where he gripped the armrest. He wasn't just hearing a story, he was reliving a memory. He had been the leader of that ground team. He had lived that moment of terrifying silence, believing he was leading his men to their deaths. He remembered the sudden, inexplicable command that came through a scrambled channel, a single calm voice that redirected his team at the last possible second, saving all their lives. He knew the legend that was born that day, the call sign. They all whispered with a mix of fear and reverence in the debriefing tents, and as I watched him, I saw the exact moment the pieces clicked into place in his mind. His eyes shot towards me wide with disbelief. General Carlson's voice pulled the focus back to the stage. He was nearing his conclusion. The commander of this operation is a legend, known to the operators on the ground by only one name. My father's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated pride. He placed a hand on Miller's arm, ready to heave him to his feet. He was so sure, so absolutely certain that he knew what was coming next. He was looking at the wrong soldier. But today, the general said, his eyes finding mine across the room, We recognize her service by her real name. Silence stretched thick and heavy. Please join me in honoring Captain Anna Jensen, known to the heroes. She brought home as the Angel of Death. The name hung in the air. An impossible truth. Before the applause even started, there was a sharp, sudden crack as Lieutenant Miller shot to his feet, his training overriding every other instinct. He snapped to perfect rigid attention. His eyes locked on me, his face a canvas of awe and terror. And then the room erupted. Hundreds of the most respected officers in the United States military were on their feet, their applause a deafening roar. I walked calmly towards the stage, my steps even, my eyes fixed on my father. His face collapsed in stages. First, a deep, profound confusion, his smile frozen and grotesque. Then denial. As he looked from me to the applauding generals and back again, his mind refusing to process the data. Finally, as I stepped onto the stage and shook the general's hand, a dawning, horrified comprehension washed over him. He was seeing his daughter, his clerk, his spreadsheet jockey, being honored by the very men he idolized. He saw a truth so absolute, so undeniable that it shattered his entire world in a single thunderous moment. My father had spent his entire life lecturing me on the rigid hierarchy of the military he loved. In the end, it took one call sign spoken in the right room for him to finally understand the chain of command. When the applause finally faded, the silence that returned was different. It was heavy with the weight of a truth that had been spoken aloud for the first time. From the stage, I could see the entire auditorium with a clarity I'd never had before. Officers, colonels, and generals, men my father had spent his entire life looking up to, were looking up at me. They started to form a line, their faces etched with a deep, genuine respect I had never seen in my own home. They saw me, not as a clerk, not as a daughter, but as a commander. My father remained in his front row seat. He was perfectly still, a man carved from stone, watching the world he knew rearrange itself around him. He looked small, like a relic from a forgotten war, while the architects of the new one bypassed him to shake my hand. One after another, they offered their congratulations. Their words concise but meaningful. They spoke of the lives I saved, of the intelligence I provided, of the respect their teams had for the unseen angel, who guided them through the dark. Each handshake was a quiet repudiation of every condescending pat on the head my father had ever given me. After the generals, Lieutenant Miller approached. The swagger was gone. Replaced by a profound and humbling difference, he stood before me, no longer the confident seal my father paraded around, but a subordinate, addressing a superior officer. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet and thick with emotion. We had no idea. Thank you for everything." It was the only validation I ever truly needed. Not from a father who refused to see me, but from a soldier whose life I had saved. He understood. That was enough. I nodded to him and he retreated. Finally, only my father was left. Still sitting. The crowd having moved on, we locked eyes across the empty space between us. There was nothing to say. His world was in ashes, and mine was just beginning. He gave a single stiff nod, then stood and walked out of the auditorium without a word. A year can change everything and nothing at all. I was Major Jensen now. My new office overlooked a bustling airfield, a constant reminder of the world I was charged with protecting. My work was my life, my purpose, my home. The weight of my father's disapproval, a burden I had carried since childhood, was simply gone. It hadn't vanished in a fiery confrontation, but had quietly dissolved in the face of an undeniable truth. His opinion no longer held any power, because I was no longer seeking his approval. I had found it elsewhere. My new family wore flight suits and combat boots. They were the elite operators I briefed in the early hours of the morning, in a secure room with a massive holographic map at its center. They were Rangers, SEALs, and Delta Force operators, the very men my father would have called real warriors. And they listened to me. They trusted my analysis. They followed my commands. And they relied on my judgment to bring them home. We were a family bound, not by blood or obligation, but by something far stronger: mutual respect and absolute competence. We had earned our place in each other's lives. One evening, as dusk settled over the airfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A notification popped up on my screen. It was an email. My heart gave a single hard thump when I saw the sender's name. My father. The subject line was just 2 words. Your work. I hesitated for a long moment, my hand hovering over the mouse. After a year of complete silence, what could he say? I finally clicked it open. The email was short, stilted, and full of military jargon. He must have looked up. He was asking for details about my command, about drones, about intelligence platforms. He used acronyms incorrectly, like a tourist trying to speak a local dialect. It was so painfully clear what he was doing. He wasn't asking how I was. He wasn't apologizing. He was trying to gather intelligence to understand the mechanics of my power, so he could recontextualize it in his own mind, to somehow make my story a part of his. A small, sad smile touched my lips. I didn't feel a shred of the old anger. Just a quiet, final sense of closure. He was never going to understand. He couldn't. I moved the cursor over the email, and without replying, I clicked archive. I turned my chair back towards the window, watching a transport plane take off into the twilight, heading towards a place I could see. But he never would. My real work and my real legacy awaited. My father believed a warrior was defined by the battles he fought in front of the world. I learned a true warrior is defined by the lives she saves in silence. If you've ever had your skills rejected by the people who should have known better, tell us in the comments how you finally proved them wrong. In this community, your expertise is always mission-critical.